The concept of repetition comes into play all the time when we talk about macros. It's the reason we actually have macros. We're trying to eliminate repetition. But there's another perspective on this that uses the idea of repetition to help us build certain macros. In this particular worksheet is a short list. It's about 42 rows. It's based on data from the longer October and September lists, which go to about 2,400 rows. And it's often easier to work with smaller amounts of data. Now, what we're going to do here is not very heavy duty, but it's going to cause some concepts to emerge. Let's say that in this list, we need to highlight the first 3 rows of each name set, make them bold, then the next 3 italic, and then back here again, bold, and then italic. If we turn on the macro recorder and go through these actions, through 5 or 6 sets of names perhaps, the code that we see in Visual Basic will be repetitious. But that's not going to happen automatically. We have to be sensitive to the idea of absolute versus relative references. If we've got absolute references turned on and we highlight these 3 cells, the code in Visual Basic will explicitly say B1 colon B3. And if we then jump to here, it will explicitly say B4 colon B6. So we want to be sure as we're highlighting different ranges here that we're embodying the concept of moving down the data. Not picking specific cells, but moving down the data. That's a relative reference. However, as we start the process, we want to make sure that we do explicitly go to cell B1. So before starting the macro recording process, we want to make sure that our setting, it's on the arrow on the macros button off the View tab. We want to make sure that relative references are turned off. If there's an orange border there, then they're on. By clicking this, we've turned that off, and just to check it again, click the drop arrow. Absolute references are in effect. So we're going to click anywhere here. Imagine the active cell could be anywhere. As we begin the process of clicking on B1, we want that to be an absolute reference, but from there on in, and we'll make the switch, we'll make them be relative references. And it's going to be helpful to see the code being built as we create this macro. So we want to make our Excel screen be roughly half the screen. Use that middle button in the upper right there. If that maximizes it, you have to pull it down manually. And then we want to jump into the Visual Basic editor. If you don't see this, press Alt F11. If you do, you can just click there and do essentially the reverse. If you've done it recently, it'll revert back to a previous look. So we want these 2 windows to roughly share half the screen each. Notice that there are no macros in this workbook called mailing list. When we're looking in the Visual Basic window, here's the name of the file. There are no modules here, but we are about to create a macro and we'll see a module. So in the Excel portion of the screen, we're ready to record. Lower left corner, we'll click the button for macro. We don't need to name this or give it a keystroke shortcut. We want to store it in this workbook. Click OK. At the moment, we don't see anything happening in the top portion of our screen. Let's click the plus next to modules. Double-click Module 1. That's the beginning of our macro. We want to jump to B1. That's an absolute reference, and that's exactly what we see in the macro. Now we want to switch to relative references. The arrow on the macros button, choose Use Relative References. Now as we highlight B1 through B3, you see the code as it appears in the window up above. And of course, that does not mean A1, A3. It means from the active cell, highlight 3 cells in the same vertical layout style as if you were highlighting A1, A3. Next step, let's make these cells bold. We can go back to the Home tab or simply press Control B. We've made them bold, and you see the code that has emerged there. We then want to highlight the next 3. And to make this process a little more visible on the bottom half of our screen, let's simply collapse the ribbon by double-clicking one of the tabs. How about the View tab? Just double-click. It's going to make this easier to see. We'll highlight the next 3 cells here and make these be italics. Control I. And then the next 3. And now Control B. And as we do this, note how the code at the top of the screen is starting to look like it's repeating. Maybe we're not quite there yet. Looks like the line we just put in we saw earlier, but we need to do a few more of these. So on the bottom of the screen, I'm going to highlight a few more, 3 more rows, and we want to make these italic. That's Control I, and then 3 more rows, Control B, 3 more rows, Control I. That's probably enough. Let's stop recording. Click that button in the lower left corner. Let's look at this code in a little more detail. In these kind of situations, usually the first line or two, each of them in this case happen to be unique. You can press enter after that to separate these. And now as we start to look at the code, and I could have recorded some more, but we see a repeating pattern. I'm going to press enter in front of this fifth line here, and that pattern gets repeated 4 more times. We don't see 3 complete cycles. We begin to see what's happening here. If we kept recording, we'd see the same lines over and over and over again. And the purpose here is not to record through all the data. We want to avoid all that. But by recording a few sets of data here, we've introduced the idea, at least potentially, of repetition. Let's get rid of this repetitious code. And now introduce the idea that there are structures in the Visual Basic language that allow us to perform certain actions over and over and over again. One of those kinds of constructions is referred to as a for, that's F-O-R, loop. And in front of this code, or before it, we want to type for, followed by a variable name that you could make up, say counter. You can use a different word if you wish. If you're learning VBA in a more formal way, you'll learn more about variables and how they need to be declared. And there are other aspects of that we don't need to get into here. It's okay to do this. For counter equals, now imagine in our list here that we've got one name for each state and DC. We know there are 51 of them. So we simply want to say, in the way we use this particular feature here, do this 51 times. And the syntax is for counter equals 1 to 51. And of course, in different situations, whatever that number might be. The concluding statement after these actions are taken is, and notice, by the way, when I clicked down there, that the word for became capitalized, the word to became capitalized. It's a good idea to always type these in lowercase. Keywords will automatically become capitalized. Next, counter. So even though we're not saying this reads exactly the way we want it to in English, you get used to it pretty quickly. Do these actions here, or perform these actions 51 times, over and over and over again. And that's the ideal command sequence to be using when we know that we have a specific set of names. This will work. In fact, we can jump right back into the worksheet here and manually, let's say we take off Control B here. It'll take off the bold. Control I takes off all of the italicized entries. Click it again. There we go. Put the active cell here and run this macro. How do we run this? We don't have a keystroke shortcut. We'll go to View, click the drop arrow for macros, view our macros. It's the only one we've got. Run the macro. And it went way beyond where we needed because this macro ran 51 times. Main point here is it certainly took care of this data. But you can see how this has a lot of use and a lot of applicability. It doesn't cover all situations, but it's one of those basic structures that you will encounter and need from time to time as you deal with large amounts of data in an Excel macro.